Good morning all, and welcome to the fourth and final virtual Pulse meetings with PGRO and Syngenta. My name's Rebecca Stilton and I'm one of the product managers for Syngenta, and I'll be hosting the meeting this morning. Today we're joined by Jim Scrimshaw, and Jim is going to talk to us about weed control options in peas and beans. But before we hand over to Jim, just a couple of housekeeping rules to follow, please. Just to let you know, we will be recording this webinar, and the recording of it will be placed onto the Syngenta YouTube channel as well as the PGRO website. We would ask that you don't record the meeting by any other means, as there's no need, because it will be hosted on those two media channels. If you wish to ask any questions, which we would thoroughly encourage, we would ask you to do that through the Q&A function. You'll find that at the bottom of your screen. If you hover your mouse around, you'll find the Q&A box. Please type your questions in there, and then Jim and I will go through a Q&A session at the end. Just to let you know, you will receive an email tomorrow if you wish to claim basis and Roadshow points. And there'll also be a link to a feedback survey, which we'd be very grateful if you can fill that in. So without further ado, I'll ask Jim to take control of the screen, and he'll talk to us about weed control in peas and beans.
Thanks, Rebecca. Hopefully we're all seeing the same as I'm seeing at the moment, my presentation. So yes, I'm going to talk to you about weed control in pulses. I'll talk about the pre-emergence options, obviously. I'll touch also on the post-emergence options, and I'll just try and point out one of the concerns that we have with Bentazone going forward, that we all need to be aware of and hopefully collectively do something about. And then bearing in mind that we've just had a season without dicot for the first time, I'll just say a few words regarding desiccation and how we may be able to move forward or not with that particular area of concern. So if we consider the pre-emergence herbicides, you'd all be sort of familiar with those products that you can see listed there down the left-hand side. We have one or two that are specific to, in this case at the bottom, curb and crawler winter beans, and then all the other ones are either available generally across all the crops, either via full approvals or via EMUs, and we'll make mention of all of them that are shown there. Why do we need a pre-emergence herbicide? Well, one, you'll see later on, if you're not familiar with peas and beans, that we are fairly restricted when it comes to post-emergence options, but also the crops themselves, particularly through early development and through, to be fair, much of their development, are not particularly competitive. They don't cover a huge ground area. There's plenty of bare soil visible for a good period of their life cycle, if you like, and it's not until, and this is obviously with peas, it's not until fairly late on that the peas, beans actually get a fair bit of biomass bulk to them, and intercept a fair bit of light that stops it getting down to the soil surface. Obviously as well, when we're planting our spring beans or spring peas or winter beans, we're at times of the year, March and April, or October, November, December time, when there's lots of broadleaf weeds and grass weeds that potentially want to germinate and compete with the crops that we are planting. Just a couple of slides before we start going through the products to illustrate how effective a pre-emergence can be. Some would argue we're not perhaps seeing the best effects from pre-emergences over the past 2 or 3 years because the springs have been quite dry, and you're right. If we have the dry conditions, then they don't tend to work as well as perhaps we would have hoped. But this was in a field where we had a trial and they were spraying around our trial and missed a little bit. So as you can see there, we've got nettles, we've got shepherd's purse, we've got groundsel. And these present at the time of harvest are either going to hinder the harvesting process. They may mean that the crop is going to mature unevenly, which these days, again, possibly poses a problem. And of course, they may well transfer moisture to a dry product and mean that we have increased drying costs. So that's where, in an area that had been missed, and immediately adjacent, we had an area that received a pre-em herbicide. As you can see, the control can be very, very good. If we first consider crawler, it's a material that is used in the winter beans. It's usually used part of a program to control blackgrass. It can be used pre or post-emergence. I would suggest it's used probably more post-emergence to try and clean up, mist or sensitize blackgrass within a blackgrass control program. As you can see, it's usually controlling or targeting the grasses because the broadleaf weed control it offers is fairly limited. If you were to be using it pre-emergence, then obviously that spectrum of activity on broadleaf weeds is not big enough. You'll be putting a mixed partner in with it, and that mixed partner would generally be pendimethalin, and we'll be mentioning pendimethalin several times as being that mixed partner of choice. Curb is the other material that we can use a pre-emergence. Again, it's mainly a grass weed control product. It does do a few more broadleaf weeds and perhaps crawler does, but again, spectrum is not huge. Again, we're probably going to be mixing that with a partner product just to boost that broadleaf weed control. And again, that product generally tends to be including pendimethalin in there. We try and apply curve 7 days or within 7 days of drilling, and we try to use it as temperatures are dropping, which work has shown it's more effective when it's used like that. And in a situation where grass weed pressure count is quite high, if we do use it appropriately, hopefully you can see from this picture that curve can do a pretty effective job in a high pressure grass weed situation. Defy Pro-Sulfur Carb has an emu for use in both winter and spring beans. It does some grasses. There is some blackgrass activity claimed. It may be useful in situations where we're just trying to keep on top of blackgrass. Broadleaf weed wise, its spectrum is not too bad. It's quite good to see that it's active on Cranesville, because that does seem to be becoming more of an issue as the seasons pass by. But again, it's probably regarded as being a bit narrow in terms of its activity. And again, as you can see there, the sort of suggested mix and rates of use, the Defy, the mixes with pendimethalin, and the Defy rates is 4 litres with 2. Defy can be used at 5 litres. People tend to wind it back to 4 and put in 2 litres of the pendi. All I would say about Defy is if you want to consider reducing that rate even further than 4 litres, I'm aware of some people that go down to 3. I would suggest, and from the work that we've done with it before it got to market, that you do see a fairly rapid drop off in its efficacy on weeds when you start dropping the rate too low. Pendimethalin, there are various generic products out there. We're illustrating Stomp Aqua here, and we have an approval in combining peas and emus in the beans. So the rate of the Aqua is 2.9 litres per hectare, but please be aware, with the various generics that are out there, they have varying amounts of pendimethalin in them. So those rates that are the approved use rates do vary for different products. So just be aware of that, be it Most Micro or Anthem or whatever. As I say, it's used quite often as a tank mix partner with some of these materials, mainly because its spectrum of activity is reasonably wide. We used to be able to apply 2,000 grams of active, but that's been wound back now to about 1,320. But even at that rate, we get some useful activity, and in conjunction with some of these materials that we're talking about, it gives us a useful boost to the broadleaf weed spectrums controlled. Also working in its favour is that compared to some of the other products we're talking about, it's comparatively cheap. It's not without its issues. If we apply it when the plumule is too close to the soil surface, then we can see peas emerging with this sort of leather distorted leaf, and we'll also see a little bit of chlorosis. It's not usually fatal. They will recover from that, but it can be quite striking. You can also pick this issue up if we have a heavy rainfall event after spraying. It's not only the peas, we can also see it in broad beans. Again, if it's wet after spraying, we can see the leaves being deformed and twisted and a bit of chlorosis. But again, it tends to be cosmetic and grow out of it fairly effectively. Clomazone comes in various guises in terms of a product name. We can use it on all the crops we're considering this morning. At the time it was released, and it's been around for quite some time now, and we've just spoken about these products prior to this meeting. Opagard and Reflex T were the herbicides that were predominantly used, but neither of them controlled cleavers. So when this came along, it was very, very popular, obviously in situations where cleavers were known to be a problem. The problem with it is, unfortunately, that it doesn't do many other weeds. It does tend to be chickweed, shepherd's purse, fool's parsley, red dead nettle, bit of hedge mustard perhaps. And although the rates are quite low, the winter rate at 0.33 and the spring rate 0.25, it's quite expensive. So when you are putting it with another product, the tank mix starts to become quite expensive, and although some people do get tempted in dropping rates, then you do get to a point where you do compromise the amount of control that you get. What's good about Clomazone is that it does, when you mix it with something else, give you more than perhaps you bargained for in terms of weed control, which can be useful. The thing to be aware with Clomazone is that I occasionally get calls saying that they put Clomazone on, but for example, their cleaver control has been rather disappointing, which can be a surprise. Now, when they tell me the rate they've dropped it down to is 0.1 or 0.15, it's not so much of a surprise. So if you start dropping the rates really much below 0.2, really, you see, as I say, a bit like Defy, you see a rapid drop off in the effectiveness of the material. We'll all be familiar with the symptoms that you see on the weeds. It's a carotenoid biosynthesis inhibitor, so the chlorophyll starts to break down and we get this bleaching effect on susceptible weeds. So here we have cleavers, the foliage going white, and eventually that whiteness gets to the growing point and we have control of that weed. We also unfortunately get an effect on crop, and it's usually more regularly seen on winter beans, because obviously as we look out the window now, conditions can be quite wet during the development or drilling time of winter beans, and we'll get this marginal bleaching as well on the crop. It is transient, it will disappear with time. However, should we get another heavy wet weather event, then even when the crop is quite well developed, here we've got enclosed buds, we can get a secondary pickup, and even crops that are sort of 0.5 metre, 75 centimetres tall, can start taking on this bleached effect. There are varietal differences or tolerances to chromosomes. Hopefully you can see from this picture, there are obviously some beans in there that have been barely affected by it, but it's only cosmetic anyway. It doesn't matter, because from all the work that's been done to date, it doesn't affect the yield. We've mentioned pendimethalin, and here we have a clomazone pendimethalin mix that is pre-formulated. We have done some work with it. It is pretty effective. There's no reason to avoid it whatsoever. I've never seen a commercial tin of it, if you like, but the work that we've done would indicate it's as good as anything under reasonable conditions. Nirvana is probably the one-stop, one-hit material, particularly if it's going to be used at the higher rates. As it says there, it can be used at 4.5 litres per hectare, and it's quite expensive. So people do tend to, or try to, wind that rate back. Perhaps a more average rate of use is something like 3.5 to 4 litres because of the cost of it. If you start dropping it much below 3.5 down to 3, which is done occasionally, there may be an inclusion in there of either a clomazone, or some may put a bit of extra pendimethalin in there. As I say, it is quite pricey. So we have pendimethalin there, and we have also the active ingredient imazamox. Whereas pendimethalin will prevent the emergence of susceptible weeds, those that escape the pendimethalin and emerge are then hopefully picked up by the imazamox. So they will pick up imazamox after emergence. They will take on they will start to darken the cotyledons, etc., and you'll get to see this purpling effect on susceptible weeds. And this is a good sign that you're going to get control of those species. The weeds that Nirvana control, the spectrum's quite large. And I must admit, although we have field pansy fool's parsley and shepherd's purse there as being weeds that are only moderately controlled. When we have a damp spring, i.e. good conditions for a pre-emergence, then those species are actually controlled fairly effectively, as are cleavers, to be fair. But if you're in a situation where you're fairly confident you are going to get cleavers, Nirvana wouldn't be a material to rely on for that control every year. There would be a need perhaps to consider including a bit of clonazone in there. Dew Gold is also a material that has a off-label approval for use in spring beans. It may be useful because, as you can see there, it does have some blackgrass activity, and that's how the IMU was gained by justifying its blackgrass, or the justification was based on blackgrass activity. In terms of other weeds that are controlled, you can see them on the left there: annual meadowgrass, mayweed, etc. You just need to be aware that the off-label approval is for a use at 1 litre per hectare, whereas all these weeds here are from a maize label where it's used at 1.4. I'm not really aware of too many people that use this regularly, certainly, but they may have some use for it if, again, they want to bolster, back up, boost any sort of blackgrass weed control program they have in mind. So we haven't got too many pre-emergence materials to go for, but to be fair, they work well given the right conditions. And we need to really seriously consider getting one on as best we can, because as you can see here, from a post-emergence point of view, we have very, very few options. We've already considered crawler used in winter beans, and as I say, it does have a post-emergence window of use. You can use it up to the end of February. Peas, we can use MCPB, so that includes products such as, Tropotoxol, Belmax straight or butoxol. It's good on thistles, good on oilseed rape, not bad on bindweed, do a bit on fat hen. So compared to Bentazone, which is the alternative, it's quite cheap. And if those are the sort of weeds you have to control, it's probably the product to choose. We can mix it with Bentazone. The issue there that you've got to be aware of, that the mix can potentially be a bit more crop damaging. Also be aware that we don't want to be putting these hormone products on when there are enclosed buds around. It can potentially cause flower or pod abortion, which obviously then influences yield. Bentazone, there used to be a number of Bentazone products available up until the end of this year. We now have effectively 2, so we only have Bazagran SG and we only have Benta 480. It's best on small weeds. Those that escape control, such as cleavers and volunteers, oilseed rape may escape. It'll control those quite effectively, and others, but in all the cases it works better on smaller examples. It's a contact material, so they have to be there to get control. As I'm sure we're all aware, it's not the cheapest stuff in the world, and it's fairly common to see people who grow beans particularly doing split applications. They'll put on what they perceive is needed to do a job in the first place, and if it's not quite enough, then obviously they have an option to go and top that application up with a bit more to gain the control they expect. Now, we've never had that split option in peas before, but we do now with the Bazagran SG. I'm not aware that the Benta 480 allows that on the label yet. Maybe it will in the future, but SG certainly does. So that may be useful. Just be aware, it needs some heat in the day really to get the best out of the product. But again, if it's too warm, they suggest on the label above 21 degrees immediately after application, then we're going to see increased crop damage. And also be aware, there are things it doesn't control, such as pansies, hemp nettle and annual meadowgrass. If that's your problem, throwing a large dose of Bentazone at a problem like that is not going to give you control, and it's going to have cost you a fair amount of money. As we say, Bentazone is a contact material, and the only reason that the peas are tolerant to it is because of the leaf wax. So ideally, particularly if we're making early applications, we need to test the leaf wax using crystal violet. We need to take samples from various points in the field. We need to dip our plants in, pull them out, and hopefully, if the crop is healthy and going to cope with the application, it will repel the dye and we'll have plants coming out of the dye solution that look something like those in the picture on the left. If we are retaining crystal violet to the levels that you see on the right, there's a good chance that we are going to see increased amounts of crop damage to that crop. We can't do that test in beans. The leaf waxes are different. And to be fair, we're probably all used to seeing an amount of damage as illustrated in these pictures here being caused by Bentazone. That damage will increase, as I've mentioned already, if temperatures are warm. It will also increase as the temperatures, as the crop development becomes more advanced. So more mature plants will tend to show more or increased levels of damage. We have, however, issues surrounding Bentazone that hopefully all of you are aware of. It is being picked up in drinking water. How does it get into the water courses? Well, it's reasonably obvious, really. There can be farmyard sources, there can be field sources. Anything that happens in the farmyard can be avoided, be it through, there should be procedures in place that mean that when you're handling the concentrate and the spray mixture in the farmyard, there should be systems in place that mean there is no contamination from any farmyard sources. In the field, we can choose nozzles. Local knowledge regarding how water moves and saturation points can minimize things such as spray drift and field drainage and surface runoff, and leaching as well to a point. And all these can be minimized. And this is what the current stewardship guidelines will help you with, controlling and minimize the pollution from field sources. The problem we have at the moment is Bentazone is highly soluble, it's mobile, it breaks down okay in the upper portions of bodies of water and the soil profile if it's nice and warm, but it's very slow at breaking down if conditions are dark and cool and there's no oxygen about, so the conditions are anaerobic. Currently, Bentazone is widely detected in surface water. It's detected every month of the year, and groundwater, which is perceived really as being practically pure and largely free from pesticides. Unfortunately, Bentazone is the most detected pesticide in groundwater. We've also got to bear in mind that as the area of oilseed rape is potentially decreasing, then quite possibly the area of peas and beans may increase, which in turn could mean that the use of Bentazone increases. Now, you don't need to be able to read all the numbers and the this, that, and the bar charts and the maps, but basically the Environment Agency have various points around the country, water catchment areas, where they monitor pollution levels, pesticide levels in the water. And what they're finding currently is that Bentazone is found more often than any other pesticide. It's found in a wider geographical spread than any other pesticide. And it's found in more months. And as we've said, it's found in every month currently than any other pesticide on the list or of concern. So what's got to be done? Well, although they're in the water treatment plants, there are procedures and methods of removing Bentazone. When there's peak amounts of Bentazone at certain times of the year, they can't cope. And just putting more treatment capacity in place is not an option going forward. The Environment Agency need to be able to see that any stewardship program that's in place is fit for purpose. And how we illustrate that it is fit for purpose is for them to be able to detect improved water quality, so that the water quality is improving. They need to be detecting a lower number of detects, and where they are detecting it, the peaks of Bentazone need to be lower. If this isn't seen to be happening over the next couple of years, it will be difficult for the Environment Agency to support Bentazone at the next review. Bentazone is a persistent problem for the water companies currently. So hopefully you're all aware of the stewardship guidelines that are currently on the Basagran SG label. These are going to be improved and expanded upon. So we're all aware of the maximum dose of 1,000 grams of hective. So at the use rate of Basagran SG anyway at 1.1 kilos, we're around 950 grams of active. We've got this sort of calendar suggestion of only using it from April in the spring and through the summer. So hopefully, as we said before, we get into the warmer, lighter conditions where it will break down easier, and there will be something on the label that will guide you to a sort of magic map sort of site where you can put in the coordinates or whatever your particular field you're intending to have, for example, beans on, and it will indicate whether you're in a groundwater protection zone, which then means that you have to seriously consider what you do using Basagran. Shallow soils are not a good idea. Low organic soils are not, organic matter soils are not ideal either. And also a reference on the label to surface water, and that's all to do with if there's going to be a lot of rainfall within the next 40 hours, then avoid using it. Be aware of drain flow if they're flowing or likely to flow within 7 days, then the guidelines would suggest you perhaps avoid using Basagran. And obviously, when it comes to runoff and spray drift, then nozzles and using 6-meter grass buffer strips or no spray zones next to water courses are what they would advise people to do. Anybody who grows peas and beans and plans to use Bentazone, by just considering these and taking note of these guidelines, can make a difference. The renewal date for Bentazone, as I understand it, will be 2024. So we haven't got long to show the Environment Agency, etc., that there are positive movements being made with the use of Bentazone. If they don't see anything, there's a good likelihood that going forward we may not have it anymore. It's been around for about 50 years. I've been here over 30, and over my time we've looked at other things that could perhaps take its place or work alongside it, but as we all know, nothing has ever got to market. So please be aware of that situation. Just a couple of words now on desiccation, harvest aid if you want. We know that we are fairly restricted in what we can do these days. I mean, what the old plan used to be, if you like, was if we had an uneven crop and we wanted to even it up, then we would apply our desiccant at a crop development stage that looked perhaps something like that. And we wanted fairly quickly to get to a stage like that. And we could do in the old days. It wasn't much of a problem. 5-7 days, and the weather worked in our favour, then we could be harvesting. Unfortunately, getting to that crop stage now is not a quick process at all. The other thing that we're trying to do with the desiccant in some situations, obviously, is take out excessive green material within the crop. Now, this is a trial from last year, and surprisingly, looking at that, it had quite a robust pre-emergence and post-emergence herbicide program applied to it, but it just shows how, unfortunately, ineffective some of these programs can be, particularly if we have dry conditions after those pre-em applications. Now, as we currently stand, we have glyphosate, and that will be okay for perhaps many guys that produce peas or beans that have used glyphosate in the past, but it's not permitted in seed crops, because if we use it on our seed crops, then the produce from those crops, it affects the germination, so it's no good for those chaps. What we did last year was that we got with the cooperation of FMC, we got an emergency off-label approval for Spotlight Plus, carfentrazone ethyl, and allegedly it was used by the guys who grew for seed. It doesn't affect the germination, as we showed with some work this season, and it does a reasonable job, but it's certainly no diclone. The year before, we'd done some work looking at, I can't actually label those sets of columns with what the materials were, but it's fairly easy to work out what they might have been. So we're looking at carfentrazone ethyls, as I've already mentioned, perhaps pyrofluorine ethyls, perhaps pelargonic acids used in different ways, etc., etc. But basically the message is, hopefully, and it's not necessarily a good message, is that if you look on the left-hand side and you look at the untreated plots, and you first of all consider the Reglone and the Roundup treat spray plots. You can see that when they were sprayed on the 8th of August, you could argue, if we say that 90% is the level at which we would consider the crop being able to be harvested, you can see that a Regulon pot basically got there in about 5 or 6 days. Roundup, you could argue it took about 2 weeks. And if you look at any of the other options that we were currently looking at in that piece of work, you are somewhere near 3 weeks before we got to a level of 90%, if we got there at all. So the message is not great. I think the plan is this year that the Bentazone ethyl will again be hopefully available on an emergency approval. It would be good to have some feedback on some of this via this webinar, if it's possible. If anybody's got an experience of Bentazone in the 2020 season, it would be good to hear how you got on. We did do some work. We think we got the efficacy slightly improved by increasing water volume, so it seemed to work a little better at 400 and 600 litres per hectare of water than in this work that's illustrated here at 200. But still, it's certainly not a replacement, any of them currently, for diquat, and arguably it falls a bit behind glyphosate still as well, but the seed guys, as I say, haven't nothing at all. So in summary, we don't have many pre-emergence options, but what we do have are quite effective, and the pre-emergence timing is very, very important because we don't have very much post-em at all. We have Bentazone, which is our main material really, certainly in beans, and there are issues with it and we need to protect it, and we can all do that together. Thank you very much for your time. Hope that's been useful. There's just a slide there showing either contact details that gets you in touch with me personally, our website details, and to technical reports and agronomy guides, etc., and just some details about crop updates and crop clinic, etc. Thank you very much. I'm sure, Rebecca, if there are any questions, we'll be sending them my way. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jim. Could you just stop sharing for me? That would be brilliant. So there are a few questions that have come in. So we'll start from the top and work our way down. This is a question around Avadex. And do you think that there's any chance of gaining an emu to help with not just black grass, but also, also bindweed, black bindweed control?
I have been in conversation with Gowan over probably ever since that Avadex was withdrawn from use in peas and beans. There was an off-label attempted in the peas shortly after its withdrawal that failed. And the problem with beans is that it's considered as a major crop. So CRD are reluctant to permit emus in a major crop, although occasionally there can be that can be worked round. As I understand it, Gowan at the time did plan to do some residue work to satisfy inclusion on label, but at my last speaking to them, whether it was because of COVID or internal restructuring, they, I don't believe, had done the work. But there may be others in the audience today that may know different. But I don't think it's certainly not imminent any use in beans anyway, or peas, trial turning up.
Yeah, it's difficult with emus on, as you say, with major crops. It is possible, I believe, if there's no other options.
And if it's a minor pest,
yeah,
right.
It's tricky. Another question, how effective are cultivations and stale seed beds in the autumn at reducing weed pressure prior to sowing peas in the spring?
I mean, obviously, if you can, I mean, stale seed beds are useful, of course, if, in blackgrass situations, if you can work the land and turn them over under reasonable conditions as you approach a spring drilling. I mean, it's very much dependent on personal actual circumstances in that situation, and seed banks, I would imagine, having some sort of idea of the the state of play in the past and what's been turned in and gone to seed previously, you would hope it would help in the majority of cases.
Lovely, thanks, Jim. Next question. What is the best product stroke rate for controlling volunteer beans in the following wheat crop?
Yes. You might have to take a name for that, Rebecca, or if the guy, you could just contact me directly. I'd have to look into that a bit more.
Yeah, we'll make a note of who that's from. What are the options for post-emergence grassweed control? I think you've probably covered that, but if you could just...
Yeah, the grassweed control, I mean, obviously, I haven't done it directly in this presentation. I mean, the range of products are fairly similar for both, be it laser, fusilades, Panarexes, Falcons, etc. They're all out there. They all have a similar range of activity. They are all very depending on the type of resistance. In your blackgrass will determine how effective they are on blackgrass. We know there's a lot of fop and dim resistance out there, so they tend to be not that effective. The most effective material that we have that is available in our veg crops, in the vining peas and the green beans, is obviously Centurion Max. It's not available currently in peas, dry peas and beans for pulse production. However, it's not there for use, but it is still being worked on. But it has been worked on for the last 3 years and hasn't obviously come to market. I believe there are continual issues being brought up that have to be addressed. So although we were hopefully expecting it 2 years ago, it's at the point of being launched or whatever, or being approved, there's something else that has to be found out, and it keeps getting delayed. So chemistry wise, we haven't got a lot in for most situations probably, and we have to rely on the cultural techniques that have been touched upon already.
Brilliant, thanks, Jim. Just to remind people, if you want to ask a question, we'll do it via the Q&A function, if that's okay with people, because I can see some have raised hands, but we're just going to do it through the Q&A. But Jim, can you just clarify for us the Spotlight emergency approval? Is that only for seed crops? It is only for seed crops, yes. Yeah, seed crops only. In fact, it's stricter than that if you read into it, that if it's not going to go for seed, it can't go for anything else. And that's not necessarily a great thing, but as I understand it, that's how it was with the last emergency approval anyway. Yeah, so if you don't make the seed grade, you can't do anything with it. Food chain. Even animal feed? No. Don't think so, no. Question on glyphosate. Does it affect germination of seed beans as well as seed peas? Yeah, it affects the germination. Wherever you've used glyphosate for crops intended for seed, then it does affect the germination, both peas and beans. And the longer it's been on, or the longer before harvest it's been on, then you see a greater effect on the germination levels. I mean, we've done some work where we've applied it up to what you could argue is about a month before you would expect to be harvesting, and you can get germinations that are, below 10% after it's been on for that length of time. But having said that, although you've applied it at that early stage, it hasn't had an impact on the yield. So maybe that gives us an inkling how the use of it may be adjusted to get the best, certainly in a high excessive vegetative material situation, to control that. Obviously it's slow at the best of times, but if we can use that and put it on a bit earlier, it may be of more use like that a bit earlier. It just depends how the labels work. Yeah. Carrying on, so what herbicide mix would you suggest for spring beans to target charlock? Target charlock, well, the best material that I've come across is
is probably nirvana, to be fair, without being too complicated about it. I mean, it can be in a good spring, as I said, with a bit of moisture about it, can be really effective. I have some pictures of some development work that we did where charlotte was a big issue, and you can see to the plot you've got this sort of patchwork effect where in somewhere, obviously the control, certainly there was charlotte all over the crop, and where the nirvana had been applied, then they were just clean, and they were clean for all the way through to harvest.
There's another spring bean and a target question here. So what rates and products would you suggest for false parsley, knot grass, red shank and mayweed in spring beans?
Yeah, I think again that's probably something best to contact me directly with, and we can discuss that, because there are options, and then it's whether the pre-em works or not, what you're going to do post-em, etc. So if that's all right with the questioner.
We'll have to rely on the questioner contacting you, because it's been sent through anonymously on here, so I can't tell you who that one is. So slightly different tact. What's the current thinking on the use of mineral oils with Bentazone in beans?
Mineral oils in beans, it's, as far as we're aware, it's done fairly commonly, really. I mean, the oils that we've done work on with Bentazone tend to be vegetable or rapeseed oils. They seem to be okay, such things like Fortune or Toil. We've also used one that's a bit more synthetic, so I think it's called Cantor. And what we found with those, that it enabled us to reduce the rate of Bentazone and maintain the efficacy of it, but not necessarily get the same levels of crop damage. So they do seem to work very effectively. They do seem to be done fairly commonly, but obviously, as what's prompted the question, there's not an approval on the label for the use of an oil with when you're spraying it onto spring beans anyway. But yeah, they seem to work. But the point is, you need to probably wind the rate back. And to be fair, with the cost of it, most people don't apply full rates of Bentazone anyway. So they although we can use it at 1.1 kilos, they'll probably apply something like 0.8 and may top up if needs be. But obviously these days with the rate reduction, there's not a lot to play with when you put it on at 0.8.
No, this is more of a statement, Andy, but I don't know if you've got any thoughts around it. There's wild oat resistance to fops and dims. Is there nothing to use in peas? Any thoughts, comments?
I don't know. As I say, we haven't got it yet. I'm not sure whether clethodim would be more effective. I've not heard any specific press releases or otherwise feedback from anywhere on that subject.
No, I think it was more of a statement, really. If you have a weedy crop of peas at desiccation timing, are you best to use glyphosate as opposing to Spotlight?
I would say so. As long as it's not a seed crop, then yes, I would. You know what? You could. I mean, carfentrazone's compared to glyphosate quite expensive as well, or certainly more expensive. So I would stick with glyphosate. I don't think there's any advantage, unless you're growing for seed, of using carfentrazone. Some people may have tried it this season past, and that's what I say. Is would it be interesting to get some feedback if there is anybody out there that's used it.
Okay, good to know. Right, this is going to test me a little bit. Is there a reason why in France they can use propyzamide post-emergence in beans, but it's not on the label in the UK? Propyzamide?
Yeah. I don't know specifically. I would guess, I'll make an educated guess, that part of the reason is because, I don't know if you remember, we didn't talk about it specifically in my presentation, but when I was talking about the protecting Bentazone, propyzamide is one of those materials that turns up regularly in ground drinking water or surface water. So I would suspect it will be difficult for an additional approval, i.e. potentially applying more at a second timing, to get through offer any approval. Some work has been done on this, and to be fair, it does seem to be all right in terms of crop safety. But I would imagine that would be quite a major hurdle to negotiate. But certainly, yeah. So that would be my thinking around it. But I know some work has been done, and it does seem okay. And yes, I suppose there's reasonable grounds to be fairly hard done by on that count.
Yeah, sure. What's the best graminicide for controlling annual meadow grass in spring beans if residual performance is poor?
Probably the only one that has some activity now is Falcon. Probably is a better one, because of the other graminicides there's very little activity at all. We used to have Aramo, but that's no longer with us. But the one closely behind that was Falcon.
Yeah, this is an interesting one, and I mean, I'd be interested in the answer to this as well, actually. It would seem the obvious trend is to reduce or ban all chemicals on food production. We're fighting a losing battle, albeit a long drawn out one. Obviously, we must have a method of control of weeds to produce effective returns. What is the long-term strategy of the industry, i.e. mechanical weeding, new sprayer tech to target only weeds, not broad spectrum sprays, etc.? Do you know of anything that's in the pipeline, Jim?
Things in the pipeline. I mean, most of you are no doubt are familiar with the clonifen, and I've spoken about it several times when we looked at it over 20 years ago, but it never came to market at that point. Work is still going on with it. And if work is still going on with it, you assume that they've still got in mind a market launch at some point. In fact, as I was aware, they were preparing to launch Emerger. I think they were going to call it a couple of years ago, but that didn't happen for whatever reason.
It's on the market now.
It's on the potatoes, isn't it?
And also carrots as well.
Yeah. I think. I mean into peas and beans where they were planning.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah.
We have had other things in recent years where the messages or the vibe that we've been getting has been positive, but again, they haven't come to fruition, if you like. But so we haven't had a huge amount into peas and beans. We've got a few options that we're looking at via other contract work that the intention is to have them to market reasonably quickly regarding herbicides. So there is movement. It's just not as vigorous, if you like, as it perhaps used to be in the past. As I say, the number of options that we have from a weed control point of view, I think in most crops have diminished over the years. I think we're reasonably fortunate in peas and beans. We don't have a lot, but they can be pretty effective. The thing that probably influences how effective they are now is, you could argue, our changing weather patterns, because unfortunately when we apply them, particularly in the spring, it's quite regularly now we do see prolonged, certainly for the past 2 years, prolonged periods of time where it's very dry, and they just don't seem to be, if you like, you don't perceive to be getting your money's worth. I think that's part of the issue, but there are things coming or planned to come, and I think as we stand in the moment, other than where we have resistance issues and everybody has similar problems depending on what crop you grow, I don't think we're in too bad a place. It's when we come to the next round and we start losing things like Bentazone. And obviously there's still threats over glyphosate, and but what's going to happen to pendimethalin? We've already had a scare regarding that in recent years as well.
Yes, I think the message is there's options out there. You just have to choose them carefully and think about where you're putting them in the program, really.
That's right.
Yeah. So thinking into winter beans, any suggestions for groundsel and charlock control?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, Nirvana's pretty good. The moisture thing, the thing with the pre-ems with winter beans is, and then sticking with the Bentazone guidelines, is that the crop is generally ready for a post-em application that don't necessarily may not necessarily fall in within the guidelines, and two, it's not generally warm enough to get the best out of the material. But in terms of actually the initial control, then Charlotte will do, Nirvana will do a reasonable job. It should have the moisture there, although the grounds of control may be the best in the world. So as I say, as a one-hit, one-product option, Nirvana tends to tick most boxes, but it's expensive, and to get the control that you expect, you have got to go at quite high rates at the 4 and 4.5 litres.
A couple of questions here on MCPB. The first part to it is, can it be used on seed pea crops? And the second part is it correct that it's being revoked?
Right, to take the first bit first, well, take the second bit first. I'm not aware of it being revoked anytime soon, but I may have that wrong. In terms of using it on seed crops, yes, I meant to mention that within the presentation. We have just recently heard, and this is following an EMU application last year. Yeah. Originally, all the MCPB products had on the label that you couldn't use them on seed crops. Now, the reasoning behind that was a bit difficult to fathom. Anyway, as it turned out, the reason was because when you apply MCPB, it tends to make the crop curl up very tightly and look, to all intents and purposes, that you've got a virus issue. So then, at that point, they stopped or had it on the label. You couldn't use it on seed crops, so you didn't have that worry. So we put an off-label approval in that we believe is going to be granted for this coming season, which will mean for those that grow seed, at least it's another tool in the box to try and keep the pressure of excessive vegetation down and have less of a reliance on a Spotlight Plus or whatever may be in place for the seed guys. So that EMU should hopefully be for the new farm version, certainly anyway, for 2021.
Good to know. Hopefully it will come through before for the season, so people can.
Well, I think they're expecting it within the coming weeks.
Good. Thinking about winter beans, any control for any suggestions for controlling black bindweed in winter beans?
Black bindweed, again, I mentioned, I would suggest the Nirvana doesn't do a bad job. It's not bad on polygonums in general. You can, I just find that, I know I'm mentioning it a lot, and I'm not saying there aren't other options, but to me, Nirvana does do a good job in most situations. But the rates have to be kept high. That's the off-putting point, because at 4.5 litres a hectare, it's probably, I don't know, I haven't had a price update for some time, but probably somewhere near 50 quid a hectare.
Gosh, that's quite a lot. You in your presentation, you talked about the damage that you get from Bentazone on the leaf, and somebody's asked, is this just cosmetic, or have you actually seen it equate to yield loss?
No, all the work that we've ever done, and we've done various bits and bobs with and without oils, and you see it quite frequently. As I say, you tend to see more or increased levels of damage. One, if it gets warm after application, which with a spring crop it may do. We certainly made some applications in the season just gone where the following day was in excess of 25 degrees C, and I sat in the field for 3 hours waiting for it to drop below 21 before I put any applications on. So you can see quite high levels, but obviously because it's contact, you tend to only damage, if you like, those leaves that it makes contact with. They tend to be ones, if you're making an early application, that are low down the plant, and the fact that you potentially lose most of those are not particularly contributing physiologically to the further development of the plant. They're putting new leaves on and continuing to develop. So although it can look quite as if you've killed the crop, you do tend to recover, and you don't tend to pick up an effect on the yield. I'm not saying that happens all the time, but certainly anything that we've done, we've not picked up a yield effect. It also, if you were also see a shortening of the crop as well, but because you've sprayed the whole field, you won't notice that. But again, that doesn't affect the yield either.
No, interesting thoughts here on, has there any work been done on companion crops in pulses to suppress weeds?
Yeah, Steve may have some more, my colleague Steve may have some information on that. I think he did some work last year, but I don't think there was anything particularly conclusive from that.
Okay, we were talking about a merger a few moments ago, and there's been a question asked of, as it's on the market, would it be possible to pursue an EMU, assuming Bayer aren't bringing it in with a full approval?
Well, as far as I'm aware, their intention is it will be coming in on a full approval.
Okay. If seedbeds are dry, precluding the use of a pre-em, is there any mix we could use in spring beans early when small weeds are emerging?
I mean, obviously, this sort of thing depends on the spectrum that you're expecting. I mean, some of the pea guys that drill really late when, you know, it is dry and the forecast going forward is dry, will, if you like, make the decision that they're not going to apply pre-emergence herbicide at all, and they will use that to subsidise, if you like, what can be a fairly expensive application of Bentazone later, but putting on a good healthy dose, if you like, and attack the issue like that. The other, some will take the opinion, again, depending on the weed spectrum expected, that they need to do something. They want to feel mentally that they have done something at that pre-emergence timing, and they may well apply a dose of pendimethalin, because that is, as I mentioned in the presentation, compared to some of the others, relatively cheap. Or they will put on a low dose of one of the others, which, you know, and it's difficult then to sort of gauge the, if you like, the economic return they are getting on something that, one's going to be compromised by the dry conditions, and two, going to be compromised by the fact that you've put only half a rate on. So it may be better to go down the more robust rate of something that's a bit cheaper, like a pendimethalin formulation, or nothing at all, if you want to think of it like that. And as I say, subsidise the Bentazone.
So there's actually a comment here been made by one of the participants on the MCPB question. They've confirmed that it's not being revoked. They may be a little bit confused with the 2,4-D. That's been.
I'm going to say I wasn't aware of it myself, but didn't mean I missed it.
And apparently the seed peas off-label has been granted, but it's not yet showing on the CRD website. So that will be in place for the season, which is good news. Yeah. And that's actually the all of the questions.
Good.
So thank you very much for that, Jim. Thank you very much for your presentation and input. All that leaves me to do is say thank you everyone for joining. We hope that you've enjoyed these 4 webinars that we've done this week. To remind you that there will be a follow-up email you'll receive tomorrow to claim your basis and Roadshow points, and also a link to a feedback survey that we would love to hear from you on, that we do look at to help us shape these meetings going forwards. A final big thank you to all of the presenters that have presented in the webinar. Wouldn't be possible without you. And also a very big thank you to Kirsty Gould, who does all the work behind the scenes to get all these meetings in place. So we hope you've enjoyed these webinars, found them useful, and we hope to see you in person very soon. Thanks very much, everyone.